Welcome to the first person to leave a pub. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey, but before we start, let me know from which city are you watching from and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about. Chapter 1. The Nephew's Doubt. It was on a Saturday morning in the latter half of November, 1895, that the affair which I have since come to regard as one of the most quietly devastating of Sherlock Holmes's cases first presented itself at our door. I say quietly because there were no screams in the night, no bloody daggers left upon mantels, no cryptic messages scrawled in foreign tongues. There was only a dead man on a street, a doctor's hasty verdict, and a nephew who could not sleep. The morning itself was dreary beyond all reasonable complaint. A sullen fog had descended upon London in the small hours and showed no inclination to lift. It pressed against the windows of 221B Baker Street like a grey hand, muffling the clatter of hansoms below and reducing the gas lamps across the road to dim, spectral suggestions of light. I sat in my chair beside the fire with the morning edition of the Times spread across my knee, though I confess I had read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a word of it. The room smelled of pipe tobacco, and cold tea and the faintly acrid residue of one of Holmes's chemical experiments, the remnants of which still occupied a corner of the dining table in a manner Mrs. Hudson had twice pointedly ignored. Holmes himself was in one of his moods. He stood at the window with his back to me, his dressing gown hanging from his lean frame like a vestment, his violin tucked beneath his chin. He was not playing, not in any sense that a charitable listener might call music. He was scraping, long, aimless, dissonant strokes that set my teeth on edge and caused the dog across the street to bark in protest. It was the sound Holmes made when his mind had nothing worthy to occupy it, and it was, I had learned through long and painful experience, the surest sign that he was ready to do something reckless out of sheer boredom. "Holmes," I ventured, setting aside my paper, "if you are determined to murder that instrument, I should prefer you do it quickly rather than by degrees." He did not turn. "The violin is not the patient, Watson. I am." He drew one final excruciating note from the strings and then lowered the bow. 3 days without a single problem worthy of the name. Lestrade has not written. Mycroft has not summoned. Even the criminal classes of London appear to have taken the weekend off. It is, he added, turning at last with an expression of profound personal injury, intolerable. "You might read," I suggested. "I have read. You might eat." "You've had nothing since yesterday afternoon." "Digestion dulls the mind." "Then perhaps you might simply sit down and allow the rest of us some peace." He regarded me with the faintest twitch of amusement at the corner of his thin lips, and I thought for a moment he might actually comply. But before he could speak, we were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening below, followed by the low murmur of Mrs. Hudson's voice and a second voice, younger, male, and notably unsteady. Holmes's eyes sharpened at once. He set the violin down on the side table with the care of a man handling a newborn and moved to the door. I heard footsteps on the stairs, not the confident tread of a man paying a social call, but the halting, uncertain pace of someone who was not entirely sure he should have come. "A young man," Holmes murmured, his hand on the doorknob. "Late 20s, agitated, has not slept. Let us see what Saturday has brought us." He opened the door just as Mrs. Hudson appeared on the landing with a young gentleman behind her. She announced him as Mr. Thomas Graves, and Holmes waved him in with a courtesy that bordered, for Holmes, on warmth, a sure sign that he had already detected something of interest. Thomas Graves was a man of perhaps 27, fair-haired and slender, with the sort of open, boyish face that might have been handsome had it not been so thoroughly ravaged by sleeplessness and worry. His collar was unevenly fastened. His cravat bore the wrinkles of having been tied, removed, and tied again. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands, which he clasped and unclasped before him as he stood in the centre of our sitting room, trembled with a faint but visible tremor. "Mr. Holmes," he began, and then stopped, as though the act of speaking the name aloud had suddenly made the reality of his visit too concrete to bear. "Sit down, Mr. Graves," said Holmes gently, guiding him toward the basket chair. "Watson, perhaps some brandy? The morning is cold, and our guest has walked some distance, from Kensington, I should say, on foot rather than by cab, which tells me either that he wished for time to think or that he could not bear to sit still." Graves looked up with startled eyes. "How on earth—" "The clay on your boots is characteristic of the Kensington footpaths after a night of fog, and the pattern of dampness on your trousers indicates sustained walking, rather than a brief transit from a cab. But these are trifles. Please, tell us what has brought you." I pressed a glass of brandy into Graves's hands. He took a sip, coughed once, and then spoke with the halting determination of a man who had rehearsed this speech in his head for 2 days and was now finding the words inadequate. "My uncle is dead, Mr. Holmes. Edmund Graves. He was found on Thursday night, face down on the cobblestones of Garner Lane, not 300 yards from the Brass Compass, the public house he frequented. The doctor said it was his heart. Cardiac failure. Inspector Lestrade was satisfied. The case, if it was ever a case at all, was closed before Friday noon." He paused. Holmes said nothing. His grey eyes were fixed upon the young man with that unblinking, almost predatory attention that I had seen unsettle far more composed visitors than Thomas Graves. "But you are not satisfied," Holmes said quietly. "No, sir, I am not." Graves set the brandy glass down with a sharp click. "My uncle was 61 years old, Mr. Holmes. Not young, I grant you, but he was strong, sound. He walked 3 miles every morning before breakfast. He ate sensibly. He drank moderately. A pint or 2 at the Brass Compass of an evening, never more. And not 5 weeks ago he visited Dr. Pelham on Harley Street for a thorough examination. Dr. Pelham pronounced him, and I have it in writing, sir, in excellent health for a man of his years. His heart was strong. His lungs were clear. There was nothing to suggest he was a man about to drop dead in the street." "Doctors have been wrong before," I offered, not unkindly. "They have, Dr. Watson, but wrong and this wrong are different things." Graves leaned forward. "There is something else. My uncle was a creature of habit. Every Thursday evening he went to the Brass Compass. He sat in the same chair. He drank his ale slowly and never, I must stress this, never left before closing. Uncle Edmund used to say that a man who wastes good ale insults both the brewer and himself. It was a small joke, but it was gospel to him." "And on Thursday," Holmes prompted. "On Thursday he left first, before anyone, at 7:45 by the barman's account. He said he felt unwell, nauseous, he said, and he walked out into the fog alone. He refused a cab. He refused company. And 20 minutes later, he was dead on the pavement." Graves' voice cracked. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth for a moment, composing himself. "Forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive," said Holmes. "Pray continue. You mentioned that your uncle had been troubled recently." Graves nodded. "In the last month or so he had become preoccupied, anxious even, which was unlike him. Uncle Edmund was the most methodical, unflappable man I have ever known. But something was weighing on him. He had been meeting regularly with his solicitor, a man named Gerald Harwick, at the pub on Thursday evenings. I asked him once what it was about, and he said only that it was a matter of accounts, and that I needn't worry myself." "And Harwick, what do you make of him?" "I've always found him pleasant enough. He has managed our family's affairs for years, respectable, well-spoken. He seemed genuinely grieved at Uncle Edmund's death. He called on me Friday morning to offer his condolences and any legal assistance I might need. Holmes's fingertips came together beneath his chin, the cathedral of thought, as I had long since come to think of it. He was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled, the fog pressed at the windows. "Mr. Graves," Holmes said at last, "you say your uncle was the first to leave the pub that evening. The first to leave a gathering is either the most bored or the most endangered. Your uncle, by your own account, was never bored at the Brass Compass. He loved the place. He loved his glass. He loved his routine. For him to abandon all three and stagger into the fog alone and unwell is not the behaviour of a man whose heart has simply failed. It is the behaviour of a man whose body was turned against him." Graves stared. "You believe he was murdered?" "I believe," said Holmes, rising from his chair and reaching for his coat, "that the Morning Post has finally delivered something worth reading. Watson, your hat and stick, if you please. We have a dead man to visit, and I find the dead far more forthcoming than the living." I rose without hesitation. Whatever malaise had gripped Holmes that morning was gone. His eyes were alight, his movements sharp and purposeful, and his voice carried that particular resonance, controlled, certain, and faintly dangerous, that I had come to associate with the opening movements of a hunt. Thomas Graves watched us with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "You'll take the case, then?" Holmes paused at the door and looked back. "Your uncle was a meticulous man, Mr. Graves, a man of routines and principles. Such men do not die carelessly. If there is a truth to be found on Garner Lane, I shall find it." He opened the door and gestured toward the stairs. "But I must ask you one thing in return. Anything. Tell no one that you have come to me. Not Hurwick, not the police, not your friends. For the present, the world must believe that Edmund Graves died of a weak heart, and that his nephew has accepted it." Holmes's gaze was steady and cold. "The man who killed your uncle, if such a man exists, is comfortable now. He believes he has succeeded, and there is no creature on earth more careless than a comfortable murderer." We descended into the fog. The game, as Holmes was so fond of saying, was afoot. Chapter 2. The Body on Garner Lane. The cab ride from Baker Street to Garner Lane was conducted largely in silence. Holmes sat with his arms folded and his chin sunk upon his chest, his sharp profile outlined against the fog-smeared window like a hawk carved in grey stone. Thomas Graves sat opposite, turning his hat brim in his hands with the restless, repetitive motion of a man whose thoughts offered him no comfort. I occupied myself by watching the city slide past in its shroud of November murk, the dim shapes of pedestrians drifting like wraiths, the muffled cries of street sellers, the occasional flare of a match in a doorway where some poor devil huddled against the chill. Garner Lane, when we reached it, proved to be a narrow, cobbled passage running between two rows of warehouses not far from the river. It was the sort of street that London produces in abundance and forgets entirely, too wide to be called an alley, too mean to deserve a proper name, serving principally as a shortcut between the commercial bustle of Tanner Street and the quieter residential lanes beyond. At midday it was gloomy. At 8 o'clock on a foggy November night, it would have been as black and silent as a tomb. Holmes stepped down from the cab and stood for a moment at the mouth of the lane, his grey eyes moving slowly across the scene with that peculiar, absorptive intensity that I had witnessed 1,000 times and never ceased to marvel at. He was not merely looking. He was reading. The cobblestones, the walls, the drainage channels, the angles of the rooftops above, as another man might read a page of printed text. "This is where they found him?" Holmes asked, walking a dozen paces into the lane and stopping beside a spot where the cobblestones were slightly darker than the rest, stained by a dampness that was not entirely attributable to the fog. "Just there," said Graves, pointing with a trembling hand, face down, his arms at his sides. The constable said it looked as though he had simply fallen. Fallen, Holmes repeated, crouching low. He produced his lens from his coat pocket and began to examine the cobblestones with a thoroughness that would have put a geologist to shame. He moved in a slow, deliberate circle around the spot where the body had lain, his knees against the wet stone, his face inches from the ground. I stood by with Graves, who watched these proceedings with the anxious bewilderment of a man witnessing a ritual whose purpose he did not understand, but whose outcome he desperately needed. "Watson," Holmes said, without looking up. "Observe the walls on either side. What do you see?" I looked. The warehouse walls were of dark, soot-stained brick, featureless and grimy. "Nothing of particular note," I admitted. "Brick, mortar, a drain pipe on the left, a boarded window above." "And the doorways?" I looked again. There were 2 recessed doorways along the lane, one on each side, both set back from the street by perhaps 3 feet, deep enough to conceal a man standing within. Both were dark, and both were empty, and both were positioned within 20 paces of where Graves' body had been found. "A man could wait in either of those doorways unseen," I said, understanding dawning. "He could indeed. On a night of heavy fog, with no gas lamp closer than 40 yards, a man standing in one of those recesses would be as invisible as if he were buried underground, and a victim walking through this lane, already unwell, disoriented, focused only on reaching home, would have no warning whatsoever." Holmes straightened up and pocketed his lens. "This was not a street where a man happened to die, Watson. This was a street chosen for the purpose." Graves made a small, involuntary sound. Holmes glanced at him with something that was not quite sympathy, but was perhaps its nearest cousin. "Take heart, Mr. Graves. The truth is unkind, but it is the only currency I trade in." He gestured toward the cab. "Now, to the mortuary. I wish to see your uncle before he is beyond my reach." The parish mortuary was a low, cheerless building off Bermondsey Street, staffed by a single attendant, a hollow-cheeked man named Jessup, who smelled of carbolic acid and resignation. He was reluctant at first to allow us access. The body had been released to the family. The funeral was set for Monday, but Holmes had a gift for persuasion that operated on a frequency most men could not resist. Part authority, part charm, part the unspoken suggestion that refusal would lead to complications far more tiresome than compliance. Within 5 minutes, Jessup was leading us down a dim corridor to the cold room where Edmund Graves awaited his final rest. I will not dwell upon the scene in excessive detail, for it is not my custom to linger upon the indignities that death visits upon the human form. Edmund Graves had been a large man, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, with the ruddy complexion and strong hands of a man who had lived well and actively. Even in death there was a solidity to him that made the official verdict of cardiac failure seem, to my medical eye, not entirely implausible. Men of his build and age did collapse. Hearts did fail without warning. It was not common in a man recently declared healthy, but it was not impossible. Holmes, however, was not interested in what was plausible. He was interested in what was true. He conducted his examination with the methodical precision of a surgeon, though his tools were limited to his lens, his fingertips, and the extraordinary acuity of his observation. He began with the hands, turning them over, studying the nails, the creases of the palms, the skin of the wrists. He moved to the face, tilting the head gently to examine the colour of the lips, the capillaries of the eyes. He studied the chest, the arms, the clothing that had been folded and placed beside the body. Then he reached the neck. I watched his expression change. It was not dramatic. With Holmes it rarely was. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a barely perceptible tightening of the jaw. He leaned closer, adjusting the angle of the lamp Jessup had provided, and passed his lens slowly across the skin of the throat, first on one side, then the other. "Watson," he said quietly, "Come here." I stepped forward and looked where he indicated. At first, I saw nothing remarkable. The skin was mottled with the general discoloration of death, unremarkable to a casual glance. But as Holmes adjusted the light and I looked more carefully, I detected what had arrested his attention, a faint horizontal band of slightly deeper discoloration running across the front and sides of the throat, approximately 2 inches in width. It was not the vivid, unmistakable mark of a ligature, not the rope burn or the bruising one associates with strangulation. It was subtler than that, a shadow within a shadow. The kind of mark that a busy doctor examining a body by gaslight on a cold night, with a verdict already forming in his mind, might very easily overlook. "What do you make of it?" Holmes asked. I considered carefully before answering. "It is consistent with pressure applied broadly across the neck, not by fingers, which would leave individual marks, nor by a cord or rope, which would leave a narrower, deeper impression. Something flat, something wide." I paused. "A strap of some kind. Leather, perhaps." "Precisely." Holmes lowered the lens, applied from behind, drawn tight, and held for no more than a minute or two. In a man already weakened and disoriented, by nausea, say, or by the shock of being seized without warning, it would require very little time. The pressure would compress the carotid arteries, inducing unconsciousness within seconds and death shortly thereafter. The marks would be minimal, easily mistaken for the ordinary mottling of post-mortem lividity, particularly in a man of this complexion. He straightened. "This was not cardiac failure, Watson. This was a killing, efficient, calculated, and designed from the first to escape detection." He turned to Jessup, who had been watching from the doorway with an expression of mounting unease. "You have been most helpful. We shall trouble you no further." To Graves, who stood pale and rigid against the far wall, Holmes said nothing, but the look that passed between them was eloquent enough. The nephew's doubt had been vindicated, and the weight of that vindication was heavier than he had been prepared for. We emerged from the mortuary into the grey afternoon. The fog had thinned slightly, but the air remained raw and damp, carrying with it the faintly brackish tang of the river. Holmes lit a cigarette and smoked in silence for a moment, his gaze directed at nothing in particular. "We shall return briefly to Garner Lane," he announced. I was not finished. Graves excused himself. He looked frankly as though he might be ill, and agreed to meet us later at Baker Street. Holmes and I returned alone to the lane, where Holmes resumed his examination of the cobblestones with renewed intensity. He moved on his hands and knees along the margins of the street, peering into crevices, running his fingers along the gaps between the stones. I stood by, serving my customary function as a patient and marginally useful witness. It was I, in fact, who found it. I had wandered a few paces from where Holmes was crouched, merely to stretch my legs, when something caught my eye in a narrow gap between 2 uneven cobblestones, close to the wall on the left side of the lane. It was small and dark, almost indistinguishable from the grime that coated everything in that dismal passage, but it had a faint metallic gleam that the surrounding filth did not. "Holmes," I said, "there is something here." He was beside me in an instant. And with a pair of tweezers produced from some inner pocket, Holmes's coat contained more instruments than many surgeons' bags. He extracted the object and held it up to the meagre light. It was a button, small, round, fashioned from dark brass, and bearing on its face an engraved crest, a serpent coiled around a quill. The workmanship was fine, the design distinctive, and the button itself was clearly from a garment of considerable quality. So it had not been lying in Garner Lane for long. There was no significant tarnish, no accumulation of dirt in the grooves of the engraving. It had arrived recently, and it had arrived violently. A few short threads still clung to the shank where it had been torn, not cut, from the fabric. Holmes studied it for a long moment. Then he wrapped it carefully in his handkerchief and placed it in his breast pocket, with the reverence of a man depositing a gemstone in a vault. "A man's buttons tell more than his words, Watson," he said, and there was in his voice that quiet, controlled satisfaction that signalled not the end of a hunt, but the confirmation that the trail was warm and the quarry real. Someone was in this lane on Thursday night who wore a jacket of very particular origin. This crest, the serpent-and-quill, is not a common emblem. It belongs to a specific institution, and the jackets that bear it are made by a specific hand. I intend to discover both before the day is out. You believe it fell from the assailant? I believe it was torn free during a brief but violent struggle, a struggle that the killer took great pains to conceal by arranging the body as though no struggle had occurred. But he could not control every detail. The fog hid him. The strap left almost no mark. The body was positioned to suggest a simple collapse, and yet this one small button, ripped from a coat in a moment of desperate exertion, he slipped free and lodged between the stones where neither the killer nor the constable thought to look. He turned and began walking toward the main road, his stride long and purposeful. The lethargy of the morning was gone entirely. In its place was the Holmes I knew best, focused, relentless, and dangerous in the way that a scalpel is dangerous, not through malice, but through an absolute, unwavering commitment to cutting through to what lay beneath. "The dead have spoken. Ah, Watson," he said as we reached the street and he raised his arm for a cab. "Now, let us hear what the living have to say." Chapter 3. The Brass Compass. It was nearing 3 o'clock when our cab deposited us before the Brass Compass, a squat timber-fronted public house wedged between a chandler's shop and a tobacconist on the southern stretch of Milford Road. The establishment had the look of a place that had been old when the century was young. Dark beams, and small windows thick with the residue of decades of pipe smoke, and a painted sign above the door depicting a nautical compass rendered in flaking brass leaf. It was not a fashionable house, nor a disreputable one. It was the sort of pub that attracted men of regular habits and modest means, men who came for the same chair and the same pint on the same evening each week, and who regarded any alteration to this sacred routine as a personal affront. Holmes paused on the pavement and studied the exterior with the same attentiveness he had brought to Garner Lane. I had long since ceased to wonder what he saw in such moments that I did not. The answer, invariably, was everything. "A pub of routines," he observed. "Note the wear pattern on the step, heaviest on the right side, indicating a regular flow of right-handed men entering with their dominant foot forward. The window boxes are empty, but the brackets are freshly painted, suggesting a proprietor who cares about appearances but has been recently preoccupied, and the hours posted on the door have been amended in a different hand, the barman, perhaps, covering for an absent owner." He pushed open the door. "Let us see if the interior confirms the exterior." It did. The Brass Compass was a single long room, low-ceilinged and warm, with a bar of scarred oak running its length and a collection of mismatched tables and chairs, arranged with the apparent randomness that, diamond pubs of this character, actually reflects an iron social geography understood by every regular and no outsider. A fire burned in a blackened grate at the far end. The air smelled of hops, tallow, and the ghost of 100,000 conversations. Behind the bar stood a tall, thin man of perhaps 50, with a long, mournful face, a carefully waxed moustache, and the watchful eyes of a man whose profession required him to observe everything and comment on nothing. He was polishing a glass with a cloth that had seen better days, and he looked up as we entered with the practised neutrality of a man assessing whether his new customers would bring profit or trouble. "Mr. Fenwick?" Holmes inquired, removing his hat. "Who's asking?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We are looking into the matter of Mr. Edmund Graves." The neutrality cracked just slightly. Fenwick set the glass down and regarded Holmes with an expression that mingled wariness with something that might have been relief. "I wondered when someone would come asking properly," he said. "The police were here Friday morning. 2 questions and a shrug, that was the extent of it. Heart failure, they said, and off they went. Didn't even finish their tea." "I intend to be more thorough," said Holmes. "May we sit?" Fenwick gestured to a table near the bar, not one of the regulars' tables. I noted, but a neutral territory near the taps. Holmes settled himself with his back to the wall, a habit so ingrained that I doubted he was even conscious of it, and fixed Fenwick with an attentive, unhurried gaze that invited confidence. "Tell me about Thursday evening," Holmes said. "From the beginning, if you would. Every detail you recall, however small." Fenwick leaned against the bar and folded his arms. He was, as it transpired, a man of excellent memory and precise habits, the sort of barman who remembered not only what each customer drank, but when they arrived, where they sat, and what mood they were in. In another life, he might have made a passable detective himself. "Mr. Graves arrived at 6:45, Fenwick began. "Same as always. Thursday was his night, had been for years. He came in, hung his coat on the 3rd peg, always the 3rd, and took his usual seat at the long table by the fire. He was in fair spirits when he arrived. Not jolly, mind you. Mr. Graves was never what you call a jolly man, but steady, comfortable. He ordered his usual pint of bitter and settled in." "Who else was present?" "Mr. Harwick, the solicitor, was already here. He'd arrived 10 minutes before Graves. Sat at the same table. They'd been doing that every Thursday for the past month or so, sitting together, talking low. Mr. Villiers came in around 7. He sat at the next table over with a couple of fellows from his warehouse. Loud as always, that one. And Nell, that's Nell Corrigan, my barmaid. She was working the floor." "Describe the seating arrangement precisely, if you would." Fenwick obliged, sketching an invisible diagram on the bar top with his finger. Graves had been at the head of the long table nearest the fire. Harwick sat 2 chairs to his left. A regular named Ogilvy occupied the chair between them, but left early. Around 7:30, to attend to a sick wife. Villiers and his companions were at the adjacent table, close enough for their boisterous conversation to carry, but not so close as to be part of Graves' party. "Now," said Holmes, leaning forward slightly, "tell me about the hour between 7 and 8. What did you observe?" "Mr. Graves and Mr. Harwick were talking. Quiet, as I said, heads together, voices low. I couldn't hear what they said, but I could see Graves' face well enough from behind the bar. He wasn't happy. There was a tightness about his jaw, a stiffness in how he held himself. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't pleasant." Fenwick paused. "But that had been the way of it for weeks. Those Thursday meetings of theirs, they weren't social. I've been behind this bar for 22 years, Mr. Holmes. I know the difference between men drinking together and men meeting over drinks. Graves and Harwick were meeting. And the drink itself? When was it served, and by whom? Nell brought the first round at 7. Graves had his bitter. Harwick had a whiskey and water. Graves was about halfway through his pint when, let me think, it must have been around 7:10. Villiers got into one of his performances. Loud voice, banging the table, telling some story about a deal he'd pulled off. Everyone looked over. Even Graves turned his head for a moment. It lasted a minute or two, that little show, and then things settled again. Holmes's eyes flickered. It was the barest movement, but I had seen it 1,000 times. The almost imperceptible reaction of a mind seizing upon a detail and filing it away with the speed and precision of a telegraph clerk. And after that, how did Graves seem? Fine, at first. Normal. But around 20 to 8, maybe 1:45, he started to look poorly. Colour went out of his face. He set his glass down and pushed it away, which... Fenwick shook his head. "That was the thing that struck me, Mr. Holmes. In all the years I've known Edmund Graves, I never once saw him leave a glass unfinished. He used to say that a man who wastes good ale insults the brewer and himself. It was practically his religion. But that night he pushed his pint away with half of it still in the glass and said he felt ill. Nauseous, he said. Needed air. Did anyone offer to accompany him? Harwick did, now that you mention it. Said something like, "Shall I call you a cab, Edmund?" Graves waved him off. Said the night air would settle his stomach and he'd walk it off. He took his coat from the peg and went out. That was the last I saw of him. Fenwick's voice dropped. The last anyone in this house saw of him alive. Holmes was silent for a moment, his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. Then he spoke in a tone of studied casualness that I recognised as anything but casual. "The glass, Mr. Fenwick, the one Graves left unfinished. What became of it?" Fenwick looked slightly abashed. "I kept it," he said. "Haven't washed it. I know that sounds peculiar, but Mr. Graves was a regular for 9 years. When I heard he'd died, I just couldn't bring myself to clear it. Sentimental, I suppose. It's still on the shelf behind the bar. Where I moved it that night. May I see it?" Fenwick reached behind him and produced a pint glass, still half full of flat, stale ale that had taken on a cloudy, unappetizing hue in the 2 days since it had been poured. He set it on the bar before Holmes with the air of a man presenting a relic. Holmes picked it up and held it to the light from the nearest window. He tilted it, studying the liquid, then raised it to his nose and inhaled. Not a casual sniff, but a deep, slow, analytical breath. He frowned. He inhaled again. Then he set the glass down and produced his lens, through which he examined the surface of the ale, the inner rim of the glass, and finally the faint residue that had dried along the sides where the liquid had settled unevenly. "Watson," he said, "your nose, if you please." I leaned forward and smelled. Beneath the expected staleness of 2-day-old ale, there was something else, a faint, sharp bitterness that did not belong. It was not strong. A man drinking quickly, or drinking in a warm and noisy pub where the senses were already occupied, might never have noticed it. But it was there, distinct and unmistakable to anyone who was looking for it. "Bitter," I said. "Botanical. Not hops. Something else. It reminds me of..." I hesitated, searching my memory. "Ipecac, perhaps, or something in that family. An emetic." "Just so." Holmes produced a small glass vial from his coat, and with Fenwick's permission, poured a measure of the ale into it, corking it tightly. "Not a poison, Mr. Fenwick. Nothing that would kill, but something that would make a man feel violently ill within 30 minutes of ingestion, ill enough to abandon his pint, his chair, and his routine, and walk out into the fog alone." He fixed the barman with a level gaze. "Someone put this in Edmund Graves's drink, and they did so in this room on Thursday evening, while he sat among people he considered friends." Fenwick's mournful face had gone quite pale. "Good God," he breathed. Holmes pocketed the vial and turned his attention to another thread. "You mentioned the barmaid, Nell Corrigan. She served the final round, you said." "Aye. Nell's been with me 2 years now. Good girl. Reliable." "And yet you told me, or rather, you began to tell me and then stopped, that she was seen speaking with a man outside the pub that evening, shortly before Graves departed." Fenwick shifted uncomfortably. "I don't want to cast suspicion on Nell, Mr. Holmes. She's a decent young woman." "I cast suspicion on no one prematurely, but I require facts. Who was the man, and when did the conversation occur?" "I don't know who he was. I only caught a glimpse through the window." Nell stepped outside for a moment, 7:30 or thereabouts, and there was a man waiting for her. Young fellow, rough-looking. They spoke for no more than a minute, whispering like, then she came back in and went about her work as if nothing had happened. I didn't ask. It wasn't my business. Holmes filed this away with a slight nod. "Is Nell working today?" "She comes in at 5. Then we shall return at 5. In the meantime, one more question. You mentioned that Graves and Harwick had been meeting here every Thursday for the past month. Were these meetings amicable, in your judgment?" Fenwick let out a slow breath through his nose. I wouldn't say amicable, no. The first week or two they seemed businesslike, tense maybe, but civil. By the third week, Graves was doing most of the talking, and Harwick was doing most of the listening, and neither of them looked pleased about it. By this last Thursday there was a coldness between them. They sat close, spoke quietly, but there was no warmth in it. They weren't drinking for pleasure, Mr. Holmes. They were arguing about something, and whatever it was, it had been getting worse. "Do you keep a ledger of your patrons' tabs?" "I do." "Might I see the entries for the past 4 Thursdays?" Fenwick produced a thick, dog-eared ledger from beneath the bar. Holmes turned the pages with nimble fingers, scanning the entries. I leaned over his shoulder and saw what he saw. On 4 consecutive Thursdays, October 24th, October 31st, November 7th, and November 14th, the names Graves and Harwick appeared together, their drinks charged to a shared tab. The pattern was as clear and regular as a heartbeat, and it had begun precisely 5 weeks before Graves' death. Holmes closed the ledger and returned it with a nod of thanks. "You have been extraordinarily helpful, Mr. Fenwick. I may call upon you again." "Any time, Mr. Holmes. Edmund Graves was a good man, a good customer. If someone did this to him, I want to know." We stepped out into the grey afternoon. The fog had lifted somewhat, replaced by a cold drizzle that clung to one's coat and face like a veil of tiny needles. Holmes turned up his collar and stood for a moment in silence, his gaze directed down the road toward the distant suggestion of the river. "The emetic is the key to the mechanism," he said at last. "Not the cause of death, but the instrument that set death in motion. Graves was made ill so that he would leave, alone, on foot, at a predictable time, along a predictable route. Someone in that pub on Thursday evening knew his habits, knew his route home, and knew that a man who prided himself on never wasting a drop of ale would only leave early if his body gave him no choice." He paused. "And someone arranged for that body to betray him." Harwick was seated 2 chairs away, I said. He was, with an empty chair between them for a portion of the evening, after the man Ogilvy left at 7:30, and a convenient distraction provided by Villiers' theatrics at precisely the moment when a pinch of powder might be dropped into an unattended glass. Holmes began to walk. "But we must not leap, Watson. We must build. The glass tells us what was done. The pub tells us where. The next question is why, and for that we must look into the life of Edmund Graves himself." 2114, Chapter 4. The Housekeeper and the Ledger. The residence of the late Edmund Graves stood on a quiet, respectable street in Kensington, a handsome terraced house of white stucco and black iron railings, distinguished from its neighbours principally by the drawn curtains in every window and the black crape wreath affixed to the door. It was the house of a man who had lived carefully, prospered modestly, and died before his time, and it wore its mourning with the same quiet dignity that had apparently characterized its owner. Thomas Graves had provided Holmes with a letter of introduction, granting us full access to the house and its contents, and it was this letter that Holmes presented to the woman who answered our knock. A stout, red-eyed woman of perhaps 55, dressed in severe black, with a face that bore the particular expression of someone who has been weeping at intervals for 2 days, and is determined to stop, but cannot quite manage it. "Mrs. Plym?" Holmes inquired, with a gentleness that always surprised those who knew him only by reputation. "I am she, and you are the gentleman Mr. Thomas mentioned, the detective." She said the word as though it were slightly foreign, something she had encountered in the pages of the Strand, but never expected to find on her doorstep. She admitted us with a wary courtesy, and led us through a dim hallway into the drawing-room, where she stood with her hands clasped before her, of her waiting our questions with the rigid composure of a woman bracing for an ordeal. Holmes, however, did not begin with questions. He began, as was his custom, with observation. He moved through the drawing-room slowly, his eyes cataloguing every surface, every ornament, every book on its shelf. He paused at the mantelpiece, where a row of framed photographs showed Edmund Graves at various stages of his life. A young man in academic robes, a middle-aged man shaking hands with some civic dignitary, and an older man standing before this very house with the satisfied expression of a man surveying his own domain. Holmes studied these briefly, then moved on to the writing desk in the corner, which was closed but not locked. "Mrs. Plim," he said, turning to face her, "how long were you in Mr. Graves' employ?" 14 years this past April, sir. I came when Mrs. Graves was still alive, God rest her. After she passed, I stayed on. Mr. Graves needed looking after, even if he'd never have admitted it. And in those 14 years, would you describe your employer as a man in good health? The best, sir. Strong as a horse, regular in his habits, never a day ill that I can recall. When I heard they said his heart gave out, She pressed her lips together. I couldn't credit it. I still can't. Nor can I, said Holmes simply. Tell me about the days before his death, the last week, say. Was there anything unusual in his behaviour? Mrs. Plim considered this with the care of a woman who took her responsibilities seriously. He was troubled, sir. That's the word I'd use. Not ill, not frightened exactly, but burdened. He spent a great deal of time in his study with the door closed. He was writing letters, I believe, though he didn't say to whom. And he was shorter with me than usual. Not unkind, mind you. Mr. Graves was never unkind, but distracted, as though his mind was somewhere else entirely. Did he receive any visitors in that final week? Only Mr. Harwick, sir, the solicitor. He called on Wednesday afternoon, the day before, and they were in the study together for nearly an hour. I brought them tea, and when I entered, they both went silent. Mr. Harwick smiled at me. Pleasant as you like, but Mr. Graves looked... Well, he looked grim. That's the only word for it. Holmes nodded slowly. And on Thursday itself? The day he died? He was in his study most of the afternoon, writing. He came out around 3 o'clock, went to the hall table and set down a letter, sealed, stamped, ready for the morning post. Then he went back in and dressed for his evening at the pub. He left the house at 6:30. That was the last time I saw him. Her voice broke on the final words, and she turned her face away. Holmes allowed her a moment, then asked in the same quiet tone, "The letter he left on the hall table, do you recall the address?" I didn't read it properly, sir, but I noticed the words Law Society because they struck me as unusual. Mr. Graves's correspondence was generally to banks and estate agents and the like. A letter to the Law Society seemed different. I glanced at Holmes. His expression had not changed, but I knew him well enough to recognize the stillness that settled over him when a piece of the puzzle slid into its appointed place. He asked no further questions on the subject. Instead, he turned his attention to Mrs. Plim herself, and it was here that his observation took a turn I had not anticipated. "That is a handsome brooch, Mrs. Plim," he remarked, as though the thought had only just occurred to him. She touched it involuntarily, a garnet brooch, oval, set in gold filigree, pinned at the collar of her black dress. It was, as Holmes had implied, a beautiful piece, and it was also, to my eye, conspicuously expensive. It was not the sort of ornament one expected to see on a housekeeper's wages, however generous the employer. "Thank you, sir," she said, and there was the faintest flicker of something in her eyes, not guilt exactly, but the shadow of discomfort that precedes guilt when a question has not yet been asked but is already feared. "It was a gift from my sister in Bath." "Your sister has excellent taste," Holmes said pleasantly, and moved on without pressing the point. But I caught the look he directed at me, brief, sharp, unmistakable. He had seen what I'd seen, and he had filed it away in that extraordinary mental architecture of his, where no detail was too small and no coincidence was trusted. We spent another quarter of an hour in the house. Holmes examined Graves's study with care, running his fingers along the bookshelves, opening drawers, studying the arrangement of papers on the desk. He noted the meticulous order of everything: letters filed by date, accounts balanced to the penny, books arranged alphabetically within their subjects. This was a man who left nothing to chance and nothing undone. A man of systems, Holmes murmured, a man who would not leave a letter unsealed or an ale unfinished without cause. Everything about Edmund Graves speaks of control, Watson, and yet, on Thursday evening, that control was taken from him. We thanked Mrs. Pym and departed. Holmes was silent in the cab for several minutes, his brow furrowed in thought. Then abruptly he rapped on the roof and redirected the driver back toward Milford Road. "We are returning to the Brass Compass?" I asked. "Briefly. There is one more thing I wish to confirm." The pub was quiet at this hour, the lull between the afternoon's last stragglers and the evening's first arrivals. Fenwick was alone behind the bar. I engaged in the eternal barman's ritual of wiping surfaces that were already clean. He looked up as we entered, with an expression of mild surprise but no displeasure. "Mr. Holmes, back so soon?" "A small matter, Mr. Fenwick. You mentioned earlier that Mr. Graves had been meeting with Mr. Harwick every Thursday for the past month. I examined your ledger briefly. Might I trouble you for a second look?" Fenwick produced the ledger without hesitation. Holmes opened it to the relevant pages, and this time studied not merely the names but the details of the orders, the times they were recorded, and the notes Fenwick had made in the margins. For Fenwick, as we had already established, was a meticulous man. "Thursday, October the 24th, Holmes read aloud. "Graves and Harwick. Shared table. 2 pints, 1 whisky. Tab settled by Graves. Your marginal note reads, what is this? Long talk. Serious." He turned the page. "October the 31st. Same arrangement. 3 pints, 2 whiskies. Tab settled by Harwick. Note, heated but quiet. November the 7th. 2 pints, 1 whisky. Tab settled by Graves. Note, G looked angry. H very calm. And finally, November the 14th, the night in question. 1 pint bitter, 1 whisky and water. Tab unsettled for obvious reasons. No marginal note." Holmes closed the ledger and returned it. "Mr. Fenwick, you are a chronicler of extraordinary value. These notes tell a story as clearly as any letter. Over 4 weeks, 2 men sat together in this room, and with each passing Thursday the tension between them grew. By the final evening one was angry and the other was calm, the posture of a man who has been accused, and a man who has prepared his defence." He paused. "Or perhaps a man who has decided that defence is no longer sufficient, and that a more permanent solution is required." Fenwick stared at him. "You're saying Harwick—" "I am saying nothing yet," Holmes interrupted gently. "I am collecting. The time for conclusions has not arrived. But when it does, Mr. Fenwick, I suspect your ledger will feature prominently in the account." We left the pub for the second time that day. The drizzle had stopped, replaced by the dull, heavy stillness of a November evening settling over London, like a lid being lowered onto a pot. Holmes walked in silence for some distance before speaking. 4 consecutive Thursdays, he said. 4 meetings between a man and his solicitor, meetings that grew increasingly strained, increasingly hostile, and at the end of the 4th, one of them is dead. He thrust his hands into his coat pockets. "The barman's ledger is a timeline of a relationship collapsing, Watson, and the housekeeper's brooch is a footnote that does not belong in the text. Someone gave Mrs. Pym a gift she cannot afford, and I do not believe it was her sister in Bath." "You think she was paid for information?" I think that a woman who noticed a letter addressed to the Law Society on her employer's desk on the very afternoon her employer was killed deserves rather more scrutiny than a weeping face and a convenient sister might otherwise invite. He hailed a cab with a sharp gesture. But not today. Today we have gathered enough threads. Tomorrow we shall begin to pull them. Chapter 5. The Unsent Letter. Sunday morning brought no improvement to the weather, but a marked improvement to Holmes's spirits. He was up before me, dressed and shaved, standing at the mantelpiece with a cup of black coffee in one hand and the brass button in the other, turning it slowly between his fingers as though it were a rosary bead upon which he was meditating some private devotion. The serpent-and-quill crest caught the firelight as it turned, winking at me like a small, malevolent eye. "You have not slept," I observed, settling into my chair. "I have not needed to. Sleep is a luxury for minds that have finished their work. Mine is only beginning." He set the button down on the mantelpiece and turned to face me. "We returned to Kensington this morning, Watson. I was thorough with the house yesterday, but I was not thorough enough with the study. There is a desk drawer I did not open, the lower left, because Mrs. Plym was watching, and I did not wish to conduct my search under the eye of a woman whose loyalties I have not yet determined. You suspect Mrs. Plym of something beyond wearing an expensive brooch? I suspect Mrs. Plym of being human, which is to say, capable of weakness when offered sufficient inducement. But suspicion is not conviction, and I require evidence before I require confessions. Today, I require the contents of that desk." Thomas Graves met us at the Kensington house by prior arrangement. He looked marginally better than he had the previous day. He had slept, at least, though not well, and he admitted us with the anxious eagerness of a man who has placed all his hopes in a single vessel and is watching the horizon for signs of its return. "Have you learned anything, Mr. Holmes?" he asked as we stood in the hallway. "I have learned a great deal, Mr. Graves, but learning and proving are different endeavours, and I am not yet in a position to do the latter. I must ask your permission to conduct a more thorough search of your uncle's study. There are papers I wish to examine, private correspondence, financial records, anything he may have kept under lock." "Of course, anything. The study is as he left it. I haven't touched a thing." "And Mrs. Plym?" "I gave her the morning off. She has been overwrought, and I thought the rest would do her good." "Excellent," said Holmes, and I noted the faintest trace of satisfaction in his voice. Mrs. Plym's absence was, I suspected, precisely what he had been counting on. The study of Edmund Graves was exactly as we had found it the day before, a room of quiet, meticulous order that reflected its owner's character as faithfully as a mirror. The bookshelves were arranged with taxonomic precision, legal references on one wall, financial records on another, and a small but well-chosen collection of literature and history on a third. The desk, a heavy mahogany piece with brass handles, sat beneath the window, its surface bare except for a blotter, an inkwell, and a small photograph of a woman I took to be the late Mrs. Graves. Holmes went directly to the lower left drawer. It was locked. He produced from his waistcoat pocket a slender instrument that I shall not describe in detail. Suffice to say that Holmes's relationship with locks was one of mutual understanding rather than mutual respect, and within 30 seconds the drawer was open. Inside was a collection of documents arranged with the same fastidious order that governed every other aspect of Graves's life. Holmes removed them one by one, spreading them across the desk with the care of a man laying out surgical instruments. There were bank statements, property deeds, correspondence with financial institutions, and a thick folder tied with red ribbon that bore the handwritten label, Graves Family Trust, Accounts and Correspondence. Holmes opened this folder first. For several minutes he read in silence, his eyes moving rapidly across the pages, his expression shifting by imperceptible degrees from interest to concentration to something cold and hard that I recognized as controlled anger. He passed each page to me as he finished it, and as I read, I began to understand why. The Graves family trust had been established by Edmund's father in 1872, intended to provide for the family's descendants in perpetuity. Its management had been entrusted to the family solicitor, a role that had passed some 7 years ago to Gerald Harwick. The trust's assets included property in Surrey, a portfolio of railway shares, and a substantial cash reserve held at Baring Brothers. The documents in Graves' possession included quarterly statements going back 3 years, and across those statements a pattern emerged that even my untrained financial eye could discern. Money was disappearing. Not in large dramatic sums that would trigger immediate alarm, but in a slow, steady hemorrhage of small withdrawals, management fees, and disbursements to entities whose names I did not recognize, and whose legitimacy I instinctively doubted. Over 3 years, the cumulative total was staggering. Graves had annotated the margins in his own hand, in red ink, with notes that grew increasingly terse and increasingly furious. No authorization given. Cannot verify this payee. £340. To whom? H refuses to clarify. And finally, on the most recent statement, dated October 1895, a single word underlined 3 times, embezzlement. He knew, I said. He knew, Holmes confirmed, and he had been building his case for weeks, methodically, precisely, in the same manner he conducted every other aspect of his life. These annotations are not the product of sudden discovery. They are the work of a man who began to suspect, investigated quietly, confirmed his fears, and then, being Edmund Graves, sat down to compile an irrefutable record before taking action. Holmes returned to the drawer. Beneath the folder at the very bottom lay a single envelope. It was of heavy cream paper, sealed with wax, and addressed in a firm, unhurried hand, "The Law Society of England and Wales, Chancery Lane, London." The date written in the upper corner was November 14th, 1895, the day Edmund Graves died. Holmes held the letter for a moment, weighing it in his hand as though its physical heft might tell him something about its contents. Then he turned to Thomas Graves, who had been standing by the door in silence, watching these proceedings with growing bewilderment. "Mr. Graves, this letter was written by your uncle on the day of his death. It is addressed to the Law Society. With your permission, I should like to open it." Thomas nodded. His face had taken on the pallor of a man who senses that the ground beneath him is about to shift in some fundamental and irreversible way. Holmes broke the seal with his thumbnail and unfolded the letter. It was 2 pages long, written in the same precise hand as the annotations in the trust documents, and it laid out, in language that was restrained but devastating, the case against Gerald Harwick. I shall not reproduce the letter in its entirety, for it was a document of considerable legal sensitivity, and its contents were ultimately presented at trial. But its substance was this. Edmund Graves had, over a period of several months, conducted a private audit of the Graves family trust. He had discovered that Gerald Harwick, in his capacity as the trust's solicitor and administrator, had systematically diverted funds totalling in excess of £2,000 over a 3-year period, through fabricated fees, payments to fictitious entities, and the quiet liquidation of assets whose proceeds never reached the trust's accounts. Graves had confronted Harwick privately. This, I realized, was the true purpose of those Thursday evening meetings at the Brass Compass, and had given him the opportunity to make restitution and resign. Harwick had prevaricated, denied, delayed, and so Graves had written this letter, intending to post it on the morning of November 15th, which would have set in motion a formal investigation by the Law Society and, in all likelihood, criminal proceedings that would have ended Gerald Harwick's career and his liberty. Edmund Graves never saw the morning of November 15th. Holmes finished reading and handed the letter to me. I read it through, then looked up to find Holmes watching Thomas Graves with an expression of unusual gentleness. "I am sorry, Mr. Graves. This will come as a shock." Thomas had sunk into the chair by the study door. His face was ashen. "Harwick," he said, and the name came out not as an accusation but as a kind of bewildered recognition, the sound of a man rearranging the furniture of his understanding. Harwick was stealing from us, from the trust, and Uncle Edmund knew. Your uncle had been confronting him for a month. Those Thursday meetings at the Brass Compass were not social calls, they were ultimatums. Your uncle was giving Harwick the chance to do the honourable thing, and when it became clear that Harwick would not, he prepared this letter. Holmes paused. The letter was to be posted on Friday morning. Your uncle was killed on Thursday night. The connection requires no great feat of deduction. But Harwick was at the pub. He was sitting with Uncle Edmund. He offered to call him a cab when he felt ill. He came to my door on Friday morning to offer his condolences. Thomas broke off, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. He sat in this house and told me how sorry he was. The most dangerous men, Holmes said quietly, are not those who rage and threaten. They are those who smile and offer assistance while the ground collapses beneath your feet. Harwick is a man of considerable composure. It is, I suspect, the quality that has allowed him to steal from your family for 3 years without detection, and to sit across from a dying man's nephew with an expression of perfect sympathy. Thomas stared at the letter in my hands. What do we do? For the moment, nothing. This letter establishes motive. Powerful, urgent, desperate motive. A man facing ruin and imprisonment will go to extraordinary lengths to prevent the posting of a single envelope. But motive alone does not convict. I must establish the means and the opportunity with equal certainty before I move. Holmes took the letter from me and returned it to its envelope. I shall keep this, with your permission. It is safer in my hands than in this house, where the person who wished to prevent its delivery may yet come looking for it. Thomas gave his consent in a voice barely above a whisper. Holmes placed the letter in his inner breast pocket, beside the glass vial of tainted ale and the brass button with the serpent-and-quill crest. 3 pieces of a puzzle that was beginning, at last, to reveal its shape. We left the Kensington house in silence. The sky was the colour of wet slate, and the trees along the street stood leafless and black against it, like the bones of hands reaching upward in supplication. Thomas remained behind, sitting in his uncle's study, staring at the annotated bank statements as though they were written in a language he was only now learning to read. In the cab, Holmes spoke at last. "The chain is forming, Watson. A man discovers he has been robbed by the person he trusted most. He confronts the thief, gives him a month to confess, and when the thief refuses, he writes a letter that will destroy him. The thief learns of the letter. How, we have not yet established, but I have my suspicions, and acts within hours. The emetic in the ale, the early departure, the waiting assailant in Garner Lane. Every element was designed to ensure that Edmund Graves did not live to see the morning post." "It is monstrous," I said. "It is logical," Holmes corrected, "which is, in its way, far worse. A crime of passion can be understood, even pitied. But this was a crime of arithmetic. A man weighed his exposure against another man's life and found the calculation acceptable. That is not madness, Watson. Of that is the cold machinery of self-preservation, operating without the inconvenience of a conscience." He fell silent, and the cab carried us through the grey streets toward Baker Street, where the fire and the familiar clutter of our rooms awaited. But I knew, as I watched Holmes's profile against the window, sharp, still, and intent as a blade, that the warmth of the hearth would not hold him long. The scent was strong now, and Sherlock Holmes was not a man who rested while the quarry was still running. "Tomorrow," he said, as we turned onto our street, "we visit the solicitor himself. I wish to see how Mr. Harwick performs when the audience is less sympathetic than a grieving nephew. Chapter 6. A Visit to the Solicitor. Gerald Harwick lived in a handsome house on Devonshire Place in Marylebone, one of those broad, cream-coloured terraces that speak of professional success and careful respectability. The brass plate beside the door read G.R. Harwick, Solicitor, and the knocker was polished to a mirror shine. It was, in every particular, the home of a man who wished the world to know that his affairs were in impeccable order. Holmes had sent a note ahead, a brief cordial message explaining that he was assisting Thomas Graves with certain matters relating to the late Mr. Edmund Graves's estate, and requesting a few minutes of Mr. Harwick's time. The pretext was deliberately bland. Holmes wished to observe Harwick at ease, not on guard, and a solicitor presented with a routine estate inquiry would have no reason to suspect he was being examined rather than consulted. We were admitted by a housemaid and shown into a ground-floor study that served as Harwick's private office. It was a room designed to inspire confidence. Leather-bound law volumes lining the walls, a turkey carpet of deep burgundy, a mahogany desk upon which papers were arranged with almost theatrical precision. Above the fireplace hung a framed diploma from the Inns of Court, and beside it a smaller frame containing a photograph of a rowing 8, young men in white squinting against the sun, with the name Dunmore Academy inscribed beneath in copper plate. Holmes glanced at the photograph as we entered. I saw his eyes rest upon it for no more than a second, but I knew that in that second he had absorbed every detail and filed it alongside the brass button in his breast pocket. Gerald Harwick rose from behind his desk to greet us. He was a man of middle years, 50 perhaps, or a well-preserved 55, with a broad, pleasant face, silver hair combed back from a high forehead, and the easy, practised manner of a man whose profession required him to put strangers at their ease. His handshake was firm, his smile warm, and his voice carried the measured cadence of a man accustomed to speaking in rooms where his words carried weight. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, a pleasure. Do sit down. Dreadful business about poor Edmund. I've known him for, well, it must be 15 years now. A terrible loss. Terrible." He settled back into his chair and arranged his features into an expression of sombre goodwill. "Thomas mentioned he'd engaged you to assist with the estate." "Quite right. Edmund's affairs are extensive, and the boy will need guidance. How can I be of help?" Holmes sat in the chair opposite, crossing one long leg over the other with an air of casual ease that I recognized as entirely manufactured. When Holmes appeared most relaxed, he was, in fact, most alert. "We are merely tying up loose ends, Mr. Harwick. Thomas is understandably overwhelmed, and I offered to make preliminary inquiries on his behalf. You managed Mr. Graves's legal affairs, I understand?" "For the past 7 years, yes. Like his previous solicitor, old Mr. Pettigrew, retired, and Edmund asked me to take over. We were friends as well as professional associates, you understand. I handled his will, his property matters, and the family trust." Harwick delivered this without the slightest tremor or hesitation. His composure was, I had to admit, remarkable. "The family trust," Holmes repeated, as though the words were new to him. "A substantial arrangement, I gather?" "Moderately so. Edmund's father established it in 72. Property in Surrey, some shares, a cash reserve. Nothing extraordinary, but well managed. Edmund took a keen interest in its performance. He was meticulous about financial matters. We reviewed the accounts together regularly. Those Thursday evenings at the Brass Compass, for instance." The faintest flicker crossed Harwick's face. Not alarm exactly, but the slight recalibration of a man who has been asked a question he did not expect. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a rueful smile. "Ah, you've spoken to the barman." Yes, Edmund and I had fallen into the habit of discussing trust matters over a pint. Informal, perhaps, but Edmund preferred it that way. He was never comfortable in offices, said they made him feel as though he were being charged by the hour. A small, appreciative laugh. That was Edmund, always practical. And the nature of those discussions, were they amicable? Entirely. We were updating his will, so primarily. Edmund had been thinking about Thomas's future. The boy has had some difficulties, as you may know, and wanted to ensure the estate was properly structured. There were some details to work through, but nothing contentious. Nothing at all. Holmes nodded as though this were perfectly satisfactory. And on the evening of November the 14th, the night Mr. Graves died. You were at the pub, I understand. I was. Arrived around 6:30 as usual. Edmund came in shortly after. We spoke for a while, business mostly, and then Edmund began to feel unwell. Turned quite pale, poor fellow. I offered to call him a cab, but he said the air would do him good and left on foot. That was the last I saw of him. Harrick shook his head slowly. If I had insisted on the cab, if I had walked with him, perhaps things would have been different. I've thought about that a great deal these past 2 days. You must not blame yourself, Holmes said. Yeah, with a sympathy so convincing that even I, who knew it to be entirely hollow, found it momentarily persuasive. After Mr. Graves left, what did you do? I stayed another 20 minutes or so, finished my drink, spoke briefly with Villiers, you know Desmond Villiers, loud fellow but harmless, and then walked home. I was in bed by 9:30. And your coachman? Did he drive you to the pub or collect you afterward? Neither. I walked both ways. It's barely a mile. Rigby had the evening off. I believe he stayed in, tending to the horses. Rigby has been with you long. 8 years. Reliable man. Quiet. Keeps to himself. Holmes smiled pleasantly and rose from his chair. You have been most generous with your time, Mr. Harwick. One small indulgence before we go. Thomas mentioned his uncle spoke highly of your horse. A bay gelding, I believe. I confess a weakness for good horse flesh. Might I trouble you for a look at the stable? It was a pretext so transparent that I marvelled at Holmes's audacity in offering it. But Harwick, whatever his other qualities, was evidently a man who enjoyed showing off his possessions, and he led us through the house and out the rear door into a small cobbled yard where a modest stable block housed 2 stalls, a tack room, and a carriage bay. The horse was indeed a handsome animal, a tall bay gelding with a white blaze, who regarded our approach with the placid indifference of a beast well fed and well kept. Holmes admired it with every appearance of genuine interest, running his hand along its flank and making the approving noises that horsemen make. But I was watching his eyes, and his eyes were not on the horse. They were on the man standing beside the far stall with a brush in his hand. Rigby was a thick-set man of perhaps 40, with a weathered face, heavy brows, and the wary, watchful expression of someone who has learned through hard experience to say as little as possible. He acknowledged our presence with a curt nod, but did not speak. He wore a coarse woolen coat and heavy boots, and he worked the brush across the horse's shoulder with the mechanical rhythm of a man performing a task so habitual that his mind was entirely elsewhere. Holmes approached him with the easy manner of a gentleman making conversation with a servant, nothing threatening, nothing pointed, and merely the idle curiosity of a visitor killing time. "Fine animal," Holmes remarked. "You keep him well." "I do my job, sir," Rigby said, without looking up. "Been with Mr. Harwick long?" "Long enough." Holmes let the silence sit for a moment, then glanced down, casually, almost accidentally, at Rigby's boots. I followed his gaze. The boots were heavy, well worn, caked with a thick layer of dried mud. But it was not ordinary London mud. It was a distinctive grey-blue clay, dense and chalky, of the kind of soil found along the tidal stretches of the Thames embankment, where the river deposits its sediment in thick, clinging layers that resist all but the most determined scrubbing. I knew that clay. I'd seen it on Saturday, caked between the cobblestones of Garner Lane. Holmes said nothing. His expression did not change. He turned his attention back to the horse, asked Rigby one or two inconsequential questions about the animal's diet, and then returned to where Harwick stood by the stable door. "A magnificent beast. You are fortunate in your coachman as well. The stable is immaculately kept." Harwick beamed. "Rigby is a treasure, dependable as clockwork." "I can see that. Well, we shall detain you no further, Mr. Harwick. Thank you again for your candour." We shook hands. Harwick walked us to the front door, repeated his condolences about Edmund, offered again to assist Thomas with any legal matters, and closed the door behind us with the satisfied air of a man who believes an interview has gone well. Holmes said nothing until we were 50 yards down the street and well beyond the range of any window. Then he stopped, turned to me, and spoke in a low, rapid voice that vibrated with suppressed intensity. "The coachman's boots, Watson. I saw them. The clay. Thames-side clay. The same grey-blue alluvial deposit found on Garner Lane, and nowhere within 2 miles of this house. Harwick claims Rigby had the evening off and stayed home. If that were true, Rigby's boots would show the mud of this yard and nothing more. Instead, they are caked with the sediment of the riverbank, the precise stretch of riverbank that Garner Lane adjoins." Holmes resumed walking, his strides long and urgent. Rigby was not home on Thursday night. He was in that alley, and he was not there by accident. "There's something else," I said. "The coat." Holmes glanced at me with an expression of surprised approval. "You noticed?" He was wearing a coat that did not suit him. The wool was too fine, the cut too tailored for a man in his position. It was a gentleman's coat on a coachman's back. Precisely. A coat lent to him, I should say, rather than given, for a coachman does not acquire such garments on his own wages, and a man like Harwick would not part with one permanently. Lent for a specific purpose, on a specific evening, perhaps to allow the wearer to pass, in the fog, for someone of a different station. Holmes's jaw tightened. Or to disguise his identity should anyone glimpse him in the lane. We walked in silence for a moment. The midday traffic of Marylebone flowed around us, cabs and carts and the steady murmur of a city going about its business, indifferent to the quiet drama unfolding in its midst. "Holmes," I said. Harwick was very smooth. "He was superb," Holmes agreed. And there was no admiration in his voice, only the cold assessment of a man measuring an adversary. Every answer prepared, every emotion calibrated. His grief was precisely the right depth, deep enough to seem genuine, shallow enough to permit helpfulness. His account of the Thursday meetings was plausible, internally consistent, and entirely false. He did not stumble, did not contradict himself, did not offer a single detail more than was necessary. That is not the behaviour of an innocent man recounting the truth. It is the behaviour of a guilty man who has rehearsed his performance until every word sits exactly where he placed it. And yet he agreed to let you see the stable. He let you walk within arm's reach of Rigby and his damning boots. Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. Because he does not yet know what I know. He believes the case is closed. Cardiac failure, full stop. He believes Thomas hired me for estate matters. He has no reason to think that I have examined the body, tested the ale, read the letter, or traced the clay of Garner Lane to his coachman's boots. His confidence is his weakness, Watson. A man who believes he has succeeded takes no precautions against discovery. The smile faded. But that advantage will not last. Once he learns that I am investigating the death rather than the estate, he will move to protect himself, and the first thing he will do is silence the weakest link in his chain. Rigby? Rigby knows everything. He carried out the act. He wore the coat. His boots place him at the scene. If Harwick suspects that the investigation is turning, he will either flee or ensure that Rigby cannot testify. We must move carefully, Watson, and we must move soon. He raised his arm for a cab, and as one rattled to a halt beside us, he added, almost as an afterthought, "The coachman's boots just told us where he was Thursday night. Now we must find the instrument he carried with him." 2119, Chapter 7, Red Threads. The following day, Monday, the 18th of November, Holmes rose with the focused, almost feverish energy that seized him when a case had reached the stage he privately referred to as the winnowing. This was the phase in which the field of possibility was systematically narrowed, as the false trails identified and discarded, and the true path laid bare. It was painstaking work, often tedious, and Holmes approached it with a relentlessness that left little room for food, rest, or conversation. "Today we eliminate," he announced, pulling on his gloves as I finished my breakfast. "There are threads hanging from this case that must be cut before I can see the pattern clearly. Villiers, the barmaid, and one more visit to Harwick's stable, though this time Watson. Our interest is not in the horse." We began with Desmond Villiers. Villiers kept offices in a cramped, cluttered building near London Bridge, from which he conducted a shipping and warehousing business that appeared to operate on equal measures of bluster and optimism. We found him behind a desk piled with invoices and shipping manifests, a red-faced, barrel-chested man with mutton-chop whiskers and a voice that seemed permanently calibrated for an audience of several hundred. He greeted our arrival with the belligerent suspicion of a man who assumed that any unexpected visitor was either a creditor or a solicitor, and was disappointed by neither. "Holmes, the detective, what the devil do you want with me?" "A few minutes of your time, Mr. Villiers. I am looking into the death of Edmund Graves." The belligerence wavered, replaced by something more complicated, a mixture of wariness and genuine discomfort. "Graves? Dreadful thing. Heart gave out, they said. I was there that night at the Compass. Saw him leave looking green. What's to look into?" "Perhaps nothing, but his nephew has asked me to satisfy a few questions, and your name has arisen." "My name? Why my name?" "Because you publicly threatened Mr. Graves in the Brass Compass a fortnight before his death, in front of a dozen witnesses, over a property transaction that went against you, because you were present on the night he died. And because you left the pub approximately 20 minutes after he did, time enough in theory to have followed him." Villiers' face, already red, deepened to a shade that suggested either fury or apoplexy, and possibly both. He rose from his chair with a violence that sent a cascade of invoices to the floor. "Now, see here? I said some things to Graves about that Bermondsey deal, yes. He undercut me and I was angry. But threatening a man over a warehouse lease and murdering him in the bloody street are rather different propositions, wouldn't you say?" "I would, which is why I am here to establish which category you fall into. Where did you go after you left the pub on Thursday night, Mr. Villiers?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Villiers' bluster collapsed. He sat down heavily, ran a hand across his face, and stared at Holmes with the expression of a man who has been cornered in a way he did not anticipate. "I can't tell you that," he said. "You must. It's a private matter." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Mr. Villiers, a man is dead. The circumstances of his death are, in my view, deeply suspicious. You have acknowledged a public quarrel with the deceased, and you were present on the night in question. If you cannot account for your movements after leaving the pub, I shall be obliged to share that fact with Scotland Yard, and Inspector Lestrade, whatever his other limitations, is not a man who overlooks an absent alibi." The silence that followed was long and painful. Villiers stared at his desk, at the scattered invoices, at the grimy window through which the grey light of London filtered like water through gauze. When he spoke, his voice had lost all its habitual volume. "I left the pub with a woman, Mrs. Adelaide Frome, and we took a cab to a hotel in Bloomsbury, the Harrington, on Bedford Place. We were there until past midnight." "Mrs. Adelaide Frome," Holmes repeated. wife of Justice Frome. Villiers winced as though struck. Yes, it has been going on for several months. If it comes out, she's ruined. I'm ruined. Her husband is not a forgiving man, and he is a very powerful one. I have no interest in your personal arrangements, Mr. Villiers. I require only verification. The cab driver, would he remember you? I expect so. I hailed him outside the pub. Red-haired fellow, older, drove a green four-wheeler. She was already waiting around the corner. Holmes asked a few further questions. The time of departure, the duration of the cab ride, the name under which they had registered at the hotel, and received answers that were consistent, specific, and delivered with the miserable candour of a man who knows that the truth, however humiliating, is his only defence. We left Villiers' office. In the stairwell, Holmes turned to me and said simply, "He is not our man. His secret is the affair, not the murder, but I shall confirm the cab driver before the day is out." He did. A brief detour to the cab stand near the brass compass produced the red-haired driver, a Mr. Tomkins, who remembered the fare precisely. A large, loud gentleman and a lady in a dark veil, collected at 8:20 on Thursday evening, driven to Bedford Place, our Bloomsbury. The timing placed Villiers in a cab heading north at the very moment Edmund Graves lay dying on Garner Lane. Villiers was eliminated. We turned next to Nell Corrigan. The barmaid lived in 2 rented rooms above a laundry on Tabard Street, Southwark, a modest address that spoke of honest wages and careful economy. She answered Holmes's knock with a look of unconcealed terror, her face white, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron into knots. She was a young woman, perhaps 25, with sharp, watchful features and the wary composure of someone who had learned early in life that strangers rarely brought good news. "Miss Corrigan, my name is Sherlock Holmes. I'm investigating the death of Edmund Graves. I should like to ask you about Thursday evening." "I've done nothing wrong," she said immediately, and the speed with which the words came out told me she had been rehearsing them. "I have not suggested otherwise. May we come in?" She admitted us to a small, scrupulously clean sitting room, and perched on the edge of a straight-backed chair, her eyes darting between Holmes and me like a bird that has spotted a cat and is calculating the distance to the nearest branch. Holmes was gentle with her. It was a quality he possessed in greater measure than most people credited, an instinct for calibrating his approach to the temperament of the person before him. With Harwick, he had been cordial and seemingly naive. With Villiers, he had been direct and relentless. With Nell Corrigan, he was patient and quiet, asking simple questions in a low voice and allowing long silences to do the work that pressure could not. "You served Mr. Graves his drink that evening?" "I did. His usual, a pint of bitter. Poured it myself, brought it to the table." "And you noticed nothing unusual in his manner when he received it?" "He was fine. Talking to Mr. Harwick, same as usual." "Later in the evening, at approximately 7:30, you stepped outside the pub for a moment. The barman, Mr. Fenwick, observed you speaking with a man in the street. Who was he?" The terror returned, sharp and immediate. Nell's hands stilled on her apron and her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment I thought she would refuse to answer. Then something in her seemed to give way, not dramatically, not with tears or confession, but with the quiet deflation of a woman who was simply too tired to maintain the pretense. "It was my brother," she said. Jack Corrigan." "And what did he want?" "Money, what he always wants." She looked at her lap. "Jack's not a bad man, Mr. Holmes, but he's not a good one either. He's been in trouble, small things, petty things, picking pockets, pinching from market stalls, nothing violent, nothing wicked, just foolish. He comes to me when he's desperate." "And he was desperate on Thursday. He'd lost his lodgings and needed 2 shillings for a doss house. I gave him what I had in my apron pocket and told him to clear off before Mr. Fenwick saw him." "And that was the entirety of your conversation?" "That was all. He was there for a minute, maybe less. Then he went off down the road, and I went back inside. She looked up, and there was a fierce, desperate honesty in her eyes. I had nothing to do with what happened to Mr. Graves. I served his drink, and I did my work, and I went home at closing. My brother is a fool and a petty thief, but he's not a killer, and neither am I. Holmes studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. I believe you, Miss Corrigan. I have one more question, and then we shall trouble you no further. During the evening, at any point, did you observe anyone approach Mr. Graves's glass while he was not attending to it? Nell considered this carefully. I wasn't watching every moment. I had other tables. But there was that time when Mr. Villiers got loud, telling some big story about a deal he'd done. Everyone at Graves's table looked over. It lasted a minute or two. I was clearing glasses at the bar, so I didn't see if anyone... She stopped. You're saying someone put something in his drink? I am exploring every possibility. Thank you, Miss Corrigan. You have been most helpful. We descended the narrow stairs to the street. Holmes was quiet for several paces, then said, The barmaid is innocent. Her brother is a petty nuisance and nothing more, another thread cut. He paused at the corner and consulted his watch. It is 2:30. We have time for one more call before the light fails. Harwick Stable? Harwick Stable, but we shall approach from the rear, via the mews. I do not wish to present myself at the front door again. Our solicitor friend was accommodating once, but a second visit so soon would sharpen even the dullest suspicion, and Harwick's wits are far from dull. The mews behind Devonshire Place were accessible through a narrow lane that ran between the rear gardens of the terrace houses. Holmes navigated the approach with the quiet confidence of a man who had studied the geography in advance, which, knowing Holmes, he almost certainly had, either from a map or from observations made during our earlier visit. We reached the stable yard from the rear. The yard was empty. Rigby was nowhere in sight, though the sound of movement from within the stable suggested he was attending to the horse. Holmes moved swiftly and silently to the tack room, a small windowless space adjacent to the main stall, its door slightly ajar. He slipped inside and I followed, pulling the door nearly closed behind us. The room smelled of leather, saddle soap, and the faintly sweet mustiness of old straw. Our bridles hung from hooks on the walls. Saddles sat on wooden racks. A collection of brushes, picks, and sundry equipment occupied a shelf above a battered workbench. Most of it was dusty, well used and unremarkable, the accumulated detritus of years of ordinary stable work. But Holmes was not interested in the ordinary. His eyes swept the room and settled within seconds on a single object hanging from a hook near the back wall, a leather strap, approximately 2 inches wide and perhaps 3 feet long, of the kind used to secure a horse's harness or to hobble a restless animal during shoeing. It was, in most respects, identical to half a dozen other straps in the room. In one respect, however, it was strikingly different. It was clean, not merely tidy, but conspicuously, almost aggressively clean, the leather freshly oiled, the surface gleaming, every trace of dirt and use meticulously removed. It hung among its fellows like a new penny in a handful of tarnished copper, and the contrast was impossible to miss once one knew what to look for. Holmes lifted it from its hook and held it taut between his hands. He examined the surface with his lens, turning it slowly, studying both sides with the minute attention he had brought to every piece of evidence in this case. Then he held it against the palm of his hand, measuring its width. 2 inches, he murmured. Precisely the width of the marks on Edmund Graves's neck. He ran his thumb along the leather. Freshly oiled within the last 3 days. Every other piece of tack in this room is neglected, dusty, cracked, stiff with age. But this single strap has been cleaned and conditioned with the care of a man erasing what it has touched. He replaced it on its hook, exactly as he had found it. Then he turned to me, and in the dim light of the tack room, yet his expression was not triumphant but grim, the look of a man who has found what he sought and takes no pleasure in the finding. "We are narrowing the noose, Watson," he said quietly, "if you'll forgive the expression." We left the stable yard as silently as we had entered and emerged into the fading afternoon. Holmes walked briskly, his hands deep in his pockets, his chin lowered against the cold. The case, I understood, had reached its tipping point. The red threads had been cut. Villiers was eliminated by his sordid alibi. Nell Corrigan was cleared by her petty, pitiable truth. What remained was a single, tightening line that led from a dead man on Garner Lane to a clean strap in a dirty stable, a coachman's muddy boots, and a solicitor's perfect composure. 2 more steps, Holmes said, as we reached the main road and he raised his arm for a cab. The housekeeper must be made to tell the truth, and then the serpent must be drawn from its hole. Chapter 8. The housekeeper's confession. Tuesday morning found Holmes in a state of unusual stillness. He sat in his chair by the fire unmoving, his pipe unlit in his hand, his gaze fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. He had been in this attitude when I came down to breakfast, and he was in it still when I finished my second cup of tea and cleared my throat in a manner that was, I confess, deliberately pointed. "You're thinking," I said. "I am deciding," he corrected, without shifting his gaze. "There is a difference. Thinking is the assembly of facts. Deciding is the selection of the moment and the method by which those facts are to be deployed. I have the facts, Watson. What I must choose now is the angle of approach. Mrs. Plym. Mrs. Plym. She is the hinge upon which this case turns. Not the murderer, not the instrument, but the conduit through which information flowed from the victim to the killer. Without her, Harwick would not have known about the letter. Without the letter, there would have been no urgency. Without urgency, Edmund Graves would be alive this morning, preparing his breakfast and planning his walk." Holmes set his pipe down. "She is not evil, Watson. I am quite certain of that. She is weak, and she was purchased, and she did not foresee the consequences of what she sold. But she must be made to speak, and the manner in which I extract that truth will determine whether she becomes a witness or a wall." "You mean to confront her directly?" "I mean to leave her no room for retreat. But gently, Watson. The sledgehammer is for Harwick. For Mrs. Plym, I require the scalpel." We arrived at the Kensington house shortly before 11. Thomas Graves had again arranged to be absent at Holmes's request. His presence, Holmes judged, would make the housekeeper defensive. And defensiveness was the enemy of confession. Mrs. Plym admitted us with the same tearful wariness she had shown on our first visit, though I thought I detected, beneath the grief, a new and sharper anxiety. She had the look of a woman who was not sleeping well and whose conscience was making itself heard in the small hours. Holmes accepted her offer of tea with a graciousness that seemed to put her partially at ease. We sat in the drawing-room, Holmes and I on the settee, Mrs. Anne Plym in the chair opposite, her hands folded in her lap, her garnet brooch glinting at her collar like a small red accusation. Holmes began with questions she had already answered. Her years of service, her employer's habits, her account of the days before his death. She repeated her earlier testimony with only minor variations, the way a truthful person will when recounting genuine memories. Holmes listened with apparent patience, nodding, murmuring the occasional acknowledgement. He was, I knew, not listening for what she said, but for what she avoided. The small deflections, the careful omissions, the places where her narrative grew vague or her eyes shifted downward. "Mrs. Plym," he said, when she had finished, "I should like to return to a small matter we touched upon during our last visit. Your brooch." Her hand moved involuntarily to her collar. "My brooch, sir?" "Yes. You mentioned it was a gift from your sister in Bath. A generous sister to bestow such a piece. A garnet set in gold filigree. I should estimate its value at £8 or £9, perhaps more. A considerable sum. My sister she is comfortable. Her husband does well. Her husband is Mr. Arthur Plym, a grocer on Milsom Street. I took the liberty of making an inquiry." Holmes's voice remained gentle, conversational, entirely without menace. "Mr. Plym's shop does a respectable trade, but not, I think, the sort of trade that permits the purchase of jewellery at £9. Particularly not for a sister-in-law." Mrs. Plym said nothing. Her fingers tightened on the brooch. "I also took the liberty," Holmes continued in the same mild tone, "of visiting the jeweller from whom the brooch was purchased. Hartley and Sons, Hatton Garden. A reputable establishment. They keep meticulous records, as jewellers must. The brooch was sold on the 14th of August this year, 3 months ago, to a gentleman who paid in cash. The clerk did not know the gentleman's name, but he described him quite clearly. A man of middle years, silver-haired, well-dressed, with a broad and pleasant face." Holmes paused. "The description, Mrs. Plym, does not match your sister's husband, but it matches someone else rather precisely." The silence that followed was terrible in its completeness. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with the steady, indifferent rhythm of a mechanism that did not care what truths were being laid bare in its presence. Mrs. Plym sat rigid in her chair, her face draining of colour by degrees, her eyes fixed on Holmes with the wide, frozen stare of a rabbit that has looked up to find the shadow of the hawk already upon it. "Mrs. Plym," Holmes said, and now his voice was very quiet, "I know that Gerald Harwick has been paying you. I know the brooch was his gift, not a bribe, perhaps, in the way you understood it, but a token of appreciation for services rendered. I know that those services consisted of reporting to Harwick on your employer's private affairs, his correspondence, his moods, his visitors, and, most critically, the contents of his desk." A sound escaped her. Not a word, not a sob, but something between the two. A small, strangled exhalation that carried in it the collapse of a pretense she had been sustaining for months. "I need you to tell me the truth now," Holmes said. "All of it, not for my sake, and not for the sake of punishment, but because a man is dead, Mrs. Plym, and the chain of events that killed him began in this house, with information that passed from your hands to Gerald Harwick's. You did not kill Edmund Graves, I'm certain of that, but you must help me understand how the man who did kill him came to know what he needed to know." Mrs. Plym broke. It was not dramatic. There was no wailing, no theatrical collapse. She simply folded, her shoulders curving inward, her chin dropping to her chest, her hands releasing the brooch and falling to her lap like birds shot from the air. When she spoke, her voice was thick and unsteady, but the words came with the desperate fluency of a confession long overdue. "It started last spring," she said. "Mr. Harwick came to the house one afternoon when Mr. Graves was out. He said he was concerned about his client, about Mr. Graves's state of mind. He said Mr. Graves had been making irrational decisions about the trust, threatening to withdraw funds, and that he, Mr. Harwick, needed to know what was troubling him so that he could help. He made it sound so reasonable, sir, so caring. He said he only wanted to look after Mr. Graves's interests." "And he offered you money?" "Not at first. At first it was just favours, small things. He asked me to mention if Mr. Graves seemed upset or if he received any unusual letters. I didn't see the harm in it. Mr. Harwick was his solicitor, after all. It seemed natural that he would want to know." She swallowed. "Then, after a few weeks, he gave me £5. He said it was for my trouble, for the extra attention. I should have refused. I know that now. But £5 is a great deal of money to a woman in my position, Mr. Holmes. And he made it seem so ordinary, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And the brooch? That came in August. He brought it himself in a velvet box. He said I had been a great help and that he wanted to show his gratitude. I think I knew even then, that something was wrong, that what he was asking me to do was not what a solicitor normally asks of a housekeeper, but I had already taken the money and the brooch, and I told myself that no harm was being done. that I was simply passing along information that Mr. Harwick would have learned anyway in the course of his work. And on the afternoon of November the 14th, Mrs. Plym closed her eyes. Mr. Graves came out of his study at 3 o'clock. He placed a letter on the hall table, sealed, stamped, ready for the post. I saw the address, the Law Society. I didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but I knew it was unusual. Mr. Graves had never written to the Law Society before, and I knew, God forgive me, I knew that Mr. Harwick would want to be told. How did you communicate with him? There was a boy, a street boy, Tommy, who ran errands in the neighbourhood. Mr. Harwick had arranged it months ago. If I needed to send word, I would give Tommy a message and a penny, and he would carry it to Mr. Harwick's house. That afternoon, I wrote a note. Just a few words. Letter on the desk, addressed to the Law Society, sealed and stamped for morning post. I gave it to Tommy at 3:30. He would have reached Mr. Harwick's house by 4:15. She opened her eyes, and they were bright with tears. That is all I did, Mr. Holmes. I sent a note. I did not know. I swear to you on my life, I did not know that anyone would be harmed. I thought Mr. Harwick would talk to him, reason with him. I thought... You thought what Harwick intended you to think, Holmes said. His voice was stern but not cruel, and there was in it a note of something that I might, in another man, have called compassion. You were used, Mrs. Plym. Harwick purchased your eyes and your loyalty with £5 and a garnet brooch. And he did so not because he wished to help Edmund Graves, but because he needed to monitor how close Graves was coming to the truth about the trust. When that truth reached its final form, the letter to the Law Society, Harwick received your message and acted within hours. He killed him, Mrs. Plym whispered. Mr. Harwick killed Mr. Graves. He arranged for Mr. Graves to be killed. The distinction is legally significant but morally negligible. Holmes rose from the settee. Mrs. Plym, you will need to make a formal statement to the police. I shall arrange for Inspector Lestrade to take your testimony in a manner that is as painless as circumstances allow. You are not the villain of this story, but you are a chapter in it, and the law will require your account. She nodded, tears running freely now, her hands limp in her lap. She looked, in that moment, like a woman who had been carrying a stone inside her chest for months, and had finally been permitted to set it down. Not with relief exactly, but with the exhausted recognition that the weight had been real, and the pretense of lightness had cost her more than she knew. We left the house in silence. The morning had turned bright and cold, a rare November sun burning through the overcast and casting sharp shadows across the pavement. Holmes walked beside me without speaking for some time. His face set in an expression that was neither satisfied nor triumphant, but simply resolute. The look of a man who has completed a necessary task and found no pleasure in it. She did not know, I said at last. No, she did not know. She is guilty of greed and weakness, but not of malice. She sold small truths for small sums, and did not imagine that the buyer would use them to commit murder. It is a common failing, Watson, the belief that information, once parted with, remains harmless. But information in the wrong hands is a weapon, and Mrs. Plym armed Harwick without ever understanding what she had done. He stopped at the corner and turned to face me. The sunlight caught his features in sharp relief, the angular jaw, the deep-set eyes, the thin line of his mouth. The chain is now complete, he said. Graves discovers the embezzlement. He confronts Harwick. He gives him a month to confess. Harwick stalls. Graves writes the letter. The housekeeper sees it and sends word. Harwick receives the message at 4:15 and knows that by the following morning his career and his liberty will be destroyed. He has 5 hours. In those 5 hours he procures an emetic, instructs his coachman, attends the pub, poisons the ale, watches his victim leave, and walks home while Rigby does the killing in the alley. Holmes paused. It is, in its dreadful way, a masterpiece of compressed planning. 5 hours from desperation to murder, and with every contingency addressed and every trace concealed. Every trace but one, I said. Every trace but a button. Holmes reached into his pocket and produced the small brass disc with the serpent-and-quill crest. He held it up to the November sun, and the engraving flashed. Tomorrow, Watson, this button goes home, and it takes Gerald Harwick with it. 053, Chapter 9, The Serpent and the Quill. Holmes spent the whole of Tuesday evening in preparation. He wrote 3 letters, one to Inspector Lestrade, one to Thomas Graves, and one to Gerald Harwick, and dispatched them by separate messengers before nightfall. He then retired to his chemical table, where he conducted a final analysis of the ale sample from the brass compass, confirming beyond any residual doubt the presence of a botanical emetic consistent with ipecac root. He recorded his findings in his notebook with the meticulous care of a man assembling evidence for a courtroom rather than a sitting room, and when he had finished, he placed the notebook, the vial, and the button together in a small leather case, which he locked and set beside his chair. "Tomorrow at 2 o'clock, he said, settling into his seat with the air of a general reviewing his dispositions on the eve of battle. Gerald Harwick will sit in that chair where you are sitting now, Watson, and I shall lay before him the full architecture of his crime. Lestrade will be in the next room. Thomas Graves will not be present. I have asked him to remain at home. This is not a scene for the grieving. You are confident Harwick will come?" "I am certain of it. My note informed him that Thomas has found among his uncle's possessions a personal item, a pocket watch, I suggested, that Edmund would have wished Harwick to have as a memento of their friendship. It is precisely the sort of sentimental gesture that Harwick cannot refuse without appearing suspicious, and precisely the sort of occasion that allows him to perform the role he has been playing since Thursday night, the devoted friend, the grieving colleague, the man with nothing to hide." Holmes's lips curved in a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "He will come because his vanity demands it, and his vanity, Watson, will be his undoing." I slept poorly that night. Holmes, I suspect, did not sleep at all. When I came down on Wednesday morning, he was dressed in his sharpest frock coat, his hair pomaded, his manner crisp and contained, the outward presentation of a man who intended every detail of the coming encounter to be under his absolute control. Mrs. Hudson had been instructed to prepare the sitting-room with particular care. The fire was banked high, the chairs arranged just so, the curtains half drawn to create a quality of light that was intimate without being dim. On it was, I realized, a stage, and Holmes was directing every element of the production. Lestrade arrived at 1:30. The inspector was a lean, ferret-faced man with sharp eyes and a professional scepticism that bordered at times on obstinacy. He had received Holmes's letter with the predictable mixture of irritation and curiosity. Irritation that a case he had closed was being reopened. Curiosity that it was Holmes doing the reopening. "I closed this as natural causes, mister." "Holmes," he said, standing in the doorway with his bowler hat in his hands. The doctor was satisfied. There was no evidence of foul play. "There was abundant evidence of foul play, Inspector. It was simply not recognized as such. I do not blame the doctor. The method was designed to evade precisely the kind of cursory examination that a busy physician conducts by gaslight on a cold night. But the evidence is there, and I have assembled it. And I believe that within the hour you will agree that Edmund Graves was murdered." Lestrade regarded Holmes with the expression of a man who has been in this position before, and knows from bitter experience that resistance is futile. "I'll listen," he said, "but I'm not arresting anyone on your say-so alone. I would not dream of asking you to. I ask only that you listen from the next room, and that you be prepared to act when the moment arrives. Lestrade was installed in Holmes's bedroom, the door left slightly ajar with a clear line of hearing to the sitting room. Holmes surveyed the arrangement, made one small adjustment to the angle of the door, and nodded with satisfaction. At precisely 2 o'clock, the front bell rang. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps ascended the stairs, followed by heavier ones, measured, unhurried, the tread of a man who believed himself to be paying a social call. The door opened, and Gerald Harwick entered the sitting room. He was, as before, immaculately presented, dark suit, white shirt, a silk cravat fastened with a gold pin, every detail polished to the high gloss of a man who understood that appearance was the first and most effective line of defence. His silver hair was neatly combed, his broad face arranged in an expression of subdued warmth appropriate to the occasion. He carried his hat in one hand and extended the other to Holmes with the easy confidence of a man among friends. "Mr. Holmes, good of you to arrange this. Poor Edmund. It's a comfort to know that Thomas thought of me." "Do sit down, Mr. Harwick. Tea?" "Thank you. No, I can't stay long. Appointments this afternoon." He settled into the chair opposite Holmes, the chair I had vacated, taking up a position by the window where I could observe without intruding, and crossed one leg over the other with the practised ease of a man accustomed to commanding any room he occupied. Holmes did not rush. He began with pleasantries, a remark about the weather, a question about Harwick's practice, an observation about the difficulty of managing estates in the current economic climate. Harwick responded fluently, effortlessly, his composure as seamless as a pane of glass. They might have been two gentlemen at a club, discussing nothing of consequence over cigars. Then Holmes shifted. The transition was almost imperceptible. A slight straightening of the spine, a subtle change in the cadence of his voice, but I felt it, and I believe Harwick, on some instinctive level, felt it too, though he gave no outward sign. "I wanted to speak with you about old-school ties, Mr. Harwick. A subject close to your heart, I think. You attended Dunmore Academy, did you not?" "I did. Fine school. Best years of my life, as the saying goes. A distinguished institution. I understand they have a rather distinctive crest, a serpent coiled around a quill, symbolic of wisdom and the law, I believe." "That's right. Every Dunmore man knows it well. And the school maintains a tradition of bespoke tailoring for its alumni, jackets bearing the crest on their buttons, made exclusively by Greer and Sons of Savile Row." A pause, microscopic, barely a heartbeat's duration, but it was there. Harwick's smile remained fixed, but something behind his eyes shifted, a faint realignment, like the first tremor of a structure that has not yet begun to fall, but has felt the ground move beneath it. "That's correct. A charming tradition. I've had mine for years." "How many jackets, if I may ask?" "2, one for daily wear, one kept for formal occasions." "And the one for daily wear. You have it still?" "Of course." Holmes reached into the leather case beside his chair. He produced the brass button and set it on the small table between them, with a soft, deliberate click. The serpent-and-quill crest caught the firelight, and for a moment the room was very still. "Do you recognize this, Mr. Harwick?" Harwick glanced at it. His gaze lingered perhaps a fraction of a second longer than a truly indifferent man's would have. "A button," he said. "Should I?" "It bears the crest of Dunmore Academy. It was made by Greer and Sons. I visited their workshop on Monday, a fascinating establishment meticulous in their records. They have produced jackets with these buttons for precisely 43 gentlemen currently residing in London. You are one of them." Holmes paused. This button was found beneath the body of Edmund Graves on Garner Lane, lodged between 2 cobblestones. It had been recently torn from a jacket. The thread still attached to the shank confirmed this. It did not belong to Mr. Graves, who attended no such school and wore no such jacket. It arrived in that alley on the night of November the 14th, on the person of the man who killed him. The silence that followed was of a different quality than any that had preceded it. It was not the silence of a drawing room or a social call. It was the silence of a trap closing. Harwick did not move. His smile remained, but it had hardened, fixed in place like a mask that the muscles beneath had forgotten how to release. His right hand, resting on the arm of the chair, was perfectly still, but his left hand, and I watched this with the focused attention of a physician trained to read the body's involuntary language, his left hand moved to the lower left side of his jacket and pressed there, lightly, briefly, in a gesture so subtle that a man not watching for it would never have noticed. Holmes noticed. "Your jacket, Mr. Harwick, the one you are wearing now. You will find, I think, that it is missing a button from the lower left front, recently torn. No, not worn through, leaving a small cluster of broken threads where the button was attached. You have been tugging at that spot since we first met, though I doubt you are conscious of the habit. It is the body's way of returning, again and again, to the sight of its guilt." Harwick's hand froze. He withdrew it slowly and placed it in his lap. Holmes continued. His voice was measured, unhurried, relentless, the voice of a man who has built his case stone by stone and is now laying the final courses with the certainty of an architect who knows the structure will hold. On the afternoon of November the 14th, you received a message from Mrs. Plim, Edmund Graves' housekeeper, whom you had been paying for months to report on his private affairs. The message informed you that Graves had written a letter to the Law Society, sealed it, and left it on the hall table for the morning post. You knew what that letter contained, because you knew what you had done. £2,000, Mr. Harwick, embezzled from the Graves family trust over 3 years through fabricated fees, fictitious payees, and the quiet liquidation of assets. Graves had discovered it. He had confronted you 4 Thursday evenings in succession at the Brass Compass, each meeting more strained than the last. And he had given you a month to confess and make restitution. You had stalled, and now he had written the letter that would end you. Harwick said nothing. His face had lost its colour. The mask of the smile was gone, replaced by a blankness that was far more terrible. The expression of a man watching the walls of his life collapse inward. "You had 5 hours," Holmes continued. "In those 5 hours you procured an emetic, ipecac root, ground to powder, easily obtained and easily concealed. You instructed your coachman, Rigby, to wait in the alley off Garner Lane at 9 o'clock, wearing your own overcoat as a disguise and carrying a leather strap from your stable. You arrived at the pub at 6:30. You sat with Graves, as you had every Thursday. And when the opportunity presented itself, during Villiers' loud distraction at 7:10, you dropped a pinch of the emetic into Graves's ale." Holmes picked up the button from the table and held it between his thumb and forefinger. The emetic took effect within 30 minutes. Graves felt violently ill. He left the pub, the first to leave, alone on foot, declining all offers of assistance. He walked down Garner Lane, where Rigby was waiting in the fog. Rigby seized him from behind. Gus applied the leather strap to his throat and held it until Graves collapsed. He arranged the body face down on the cobblestones to simulate a fall, pocketed the strap, and fled. But in the struggle, one of the buttons on your overcoat, the coat you had lent Rigby for the evening, tore free and fell beneath the victim's body where it lay until I found it. Holmes set the button down again. The click of brass on wood was the only sound in the room. "The strap is in your stable. It has been cleaned and oiled, but the width matches the marks on Graves's neck precisely. The clay on Rigby's boots places him on Garner Lane, not at your home. Mrs. Plim has confessed to her role as your informant, and the letter that Graves intended to post, the letter that would have destroyed you, is in my possession, along with 3 years of annotated trust accounts documenting every penny you stole." Holmes leaned back in his chair. His grey eyes rested on Harwick with an expression that held neither anger nor satisfaction, only the calm, implacable clarity of a mind that had followed a trail to its end and found, at the terminus, exactly what it expected. "You have nothing to say, Mr. Harwick?" Harwick opened his mouth. No sound emerged. He closed it again. His hands lay in his lap like dead things, and his face, that broad, pleasant, a silver-framed face that had charmed clients and concealed theft and offered condolences to a dead man's nephew, was the colour of candle wax. The bedroom door opened. Lestrade stepped into the room, his expression grim, his warrant card already in his hand. "Gerald Harwick," he said, "I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Edmund Graves." Harwick did not resist. He did not speak. Maybe he rose from the chair with the mechanical stiffness of a man whose body was operating without the guidance of his mind, and he allowed Lestrade to lead him from the room and down the stairs without a word of protest, denial, or explanation. The front door closed behind them, and the house on Baker Street was silent. Holmes sat motionless for a long moment, staring at the empty chair. Then he reached for the button, turned it once between his fingers, and placed it back in the leather case. "Rigby?" I asked. "Lestrade has men at the stable. He will be taken within the hour. And unlike his master, Watson, I suspect Rigby will talk. Men of Harwick's stamp maintain their silence out of pride. Men of Rigby's stamp maintain theirs only as long as they believe their employer can protect them." That belief ended when Harwick walked out of this room in handcuffs. Chapter 10. The Morning Post. The days that followed Gerald Harwick's arrest passed with the peculiar anticlimax that so often attends the conclusion of a serious criminal matter. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, operates at its own deliberate pace, and while Holmes had provided the engine, it was the courts and the constabulary who would now determine its speed and direction. For Holmes himself, the case was finished. The intellectual challenge had been met, the puzzle solved, the chain of evidence forged and delivered. What remained was paperwork, testimony, and the slow grinding of the legal mills, work for solicitors and magistrates, not for consulting detectives. Rigby, as Holmes had predicted, did not hold his silence long. He was apprehended at the Devonshire Place stable less than 40 minutes after Harwick's arrest, discovered in the act of packing a canvas bag with what appeared to be the hastily assembled provisions of a man preparing to flee. He was brought to Scotland Yard, where Lestrade conducted the interview, and within 2 hours he had confessed to everything. Holmes received the details from Lestrade that same evening, relayed in a terse but comprehensive note that Holmes read aloud to me by the fire with the dispassionate precision of a man reading a railway timetable. Rigby's account confirmed every element of Holmes's reconstruction. He had been in Harwick's employ for 8 years, not, as it transpired, out of any particular loyalty or affection, but because Harwick possessed knowledge of Rigby's past that made departure impossible. Rigby had served 3 years in Pentonville for aggravated assault in his youth, a fact he had concealed when entering domestic service, and which Harwick had discovered through his legal connections. The solicitor had held this knowledge over his coachman like a blade, never overtly threatening, but always implying that continued obedience was the price of continued silence. It was a leash of the most effective kind, invisible, weightless, and unbreakable. On the afternoon of November the 14th, Harwick had summoned Rigby to the study and given him his instructions. The coachman was to take Harwick's overcoat and a leather strap from the stable, proceed on foot to Garner Lane, and wait in the recessed doorway on the eastern side of the passage from 9 o'clock onward. When a man fitting Graves's description entered the lane, a large, broad-shouldered gentleman probably walking unsteadily, Rigby was to seize him from behind, apply the strap to his throat, hold it until resistance ceased, arrange the body face down on the cobblestones, and leave by the northern end of the lane. Under no circumstances was he to speak, run, or deviate from the route Harwick had specified. Rigby had carried out these instructions to the letter. He had waited in the doorway for approximately 10 minutes before Graves appeared, walking slowly, one hand braced against the wall, clearly in the grip of severe nausea. Rigby had stepped out behind him, looped the strap around his throat, and pulled. Graves had struggled, briefly, desperately, with the convulsive strength of a man fighting for his life, and it was during this struggle that the button had been torn from the overcoat. Rigby had not noticed its loss. In less than a minute, Graves had gone limp. Rigby had lowered him to the ground, positioned him face down, removed the strap, and walked north through the fog to Harwick's house, where he had cleaned the strap, returned the overcoat, and retired to his quarters above the stable. He had not slept since. A wretched instrument, Holmes said, setting Lestrade's letter aside. Used and discarded, like the strap itself. Harwick chose his tools well, a man with a criminal past, no prospects, and no power to refuse. Rigby will hang for this, Watson, and Harwick will hang beside him, and of the two, I confess it is Harwick whose fate troubles me less. Rigby is a brute, but he is a brute who was kept on a chain. Harwick is the man who held the chain and pointed. Will Rigby's testimony be sufficient to convict Harwick? Rigby's testimony, combined with the physical evidence, the button, the strap, the clay, the emetic, and Mrs. Plym's confession regarding the information chain and the letter establishing motive, will present a case that even the most sympathetic jury could not ignore. Harwick will engage the best counsel money can buy, or rather, the best counsel Edmund Graves' stolen money can buy, but the facts are inescapable. The Crown's case is, if I may say so without excessive modesty, airtight. It was on a Friday, 10 days after the arrest, that Thomas Graves called at Baker Street for the last time. The morning was bright and cold, one of those rare November days when the sun asserts itself against the season, and the air has a clarity that makes London, for a few brief hours, almost beautiful. Thomas arrived looking markedly different from the dishevelled, trembling young man who had first appeared on our doorstep. He was still pale, still marked by the strain of the preceding weeks, but there was a steadiness in his bearing and a resolve in his eyes that had not been there before. Grief had not broken him. It had, if anything, sharpened him. He shook Holmes's hand with a warmth that was, I thought, entirely genuine, and mine with equal feeling. He sat in the basket chair, the same chair he had occupied on that first desperate Saturday morning, and for a moment simply looked around the room, as though memorizing the details of a place that had come to represent, for him, the point at which his uncle's death had been transformed from an inexplicable loss into a comprehensible, if terrible, truth. "I have come to thank you, Mr. Holmes," he said, "and to tell you something that I hope would have pleased my uncle." "You have posted the letter," Holmes said. Thomas looked startled. "How did you—" "It is what your uncle intended. It is what you, being your uncle's nephew, would feel compelled to complete. And you have the look of a man who has just discharged an obligation that has been weighing upon him." Thomas smiled, a small, rueful, genuine smile that was the first I had seen from him. "I posted it yesterday morning. The original are in Uncle Edmund's hand, addressed to the Law Society. Better late than never. Your uncle would approve." "I believe he would." Thomas paused. "Mr. Holmes, there is one thing I must ask. When you first heard my account, that first morning, when I came to you with nothing more than a feeling that something was wrong, did you believe me?" Holmes considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I believed that your account warranted investigation. Your uncle's physician had declared him healthy. His habits were unvarying. His departure from the pub was anomalous. These were facts, not feelings, and facts are always worth pursuing. But if you are asking whether I suspected Harwick from the beginning, yes. From the moment you told me that your uncle's solicitor was also his weekly drinking companion, I found the arrangement suggestive. Why? Because a man does not drink weekly with the person he is defrauding, unless he is monitoring how close his victim has come to the truth. Those Thursday evenings were not social occasions, Mr. Graves. They were reconnaissance. Harwick sat across from your uncle week after week, measuring his suspicion, gauging his resolve, calculating how much time remained before the axe fell. And when he determined that the axe was about to fall, when Mrs. Plym's message told him the letter was written and sealed, he acted with the swiftness of a man who had been preparing for that moment all along. Thomas absorbed this in silence. Then he rose and extended his hand once more. The trust is being restored. The courts have frozen Harwick's assets pending trial, and the Law Society has begun its own inquiry. It will take time, but Uncle Edmund's estate will be made whole. He hesitated. I also wanted you to know I have settled my debts. All of them. I sold a property in Surrey that was part of the trust, with the court's permission, and paid what I owed. I will not be that man any more, Mr. Holmes. The man with no alibi and a bookmaker's debt. My uncle deserved better, and so do I. Holmes inclined his head. Your uncle would approve of that as well. Thomas left. His footsteps on the stairs were steady and unhurried, the tread of a man who knew where he was going, which was more than could have been said of him a fortnight earlier. Holmes stood at the window and watched him disappear into the bright morning. Then he turned back to the room, and I saw in his face an expression I had learned, over the years, to recognize but never to remark upon, a quiet, private weariness that came not from exhaustion, but from the particular melancholy of a man who had seen once again, and how easily trust could be corrupted, and how much damage a single act of betrayal could leave in its wake. A satisfactory conclusion, I ventured. A just one, Holmes said. Whether it is satisfactory depends upon one's definition of the word. Harwick will face trial. Rigby has turned King's evidence and will receive a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. Mrs. Plym will be called as a witness, and will endure the public humiliation of her role, which is punishment enough for a woman whose crime was weakness rather than malice. The trust will be restored. Thomas will rebuild. The Law Society will investigate. The machinery will turn. And yet, Holmes picked up his pipe and began to fill it with slow, deliberate movements. And yet Edmund Graves is dead, Watson. A meticulous, principled, scrupulously honest man who did everything right, who discovered the fraud, confronted the fraudster, gave him every chance to confess, and when all else failed, sat down and wrote a letter to the proper authorities in his precise, careful hand. He did everything right, and he is dead. Because he was too methodical, too orderly, too trusting of the Morning Post. Holmes struck a match and held it to the bowl. The tobacco caught, and a curl of blue smoke rose toward the ceiling. Punctuality is a virtue that, on occasion, proves fatal. Had Graves posted that letter immediately, had he walked to the post office that afternoon instead of waiting for the next morning's collection, Harwick would have had no window in which to act. The letter would have been beyond recall, the damage done, and Graves would be alive today, reading his newspaper and preparing for his Thursday pint. You cannot blame the victim for his own murder, Holmes. I do not blame him. I observe the irony. It is a bitter one. He drew on his pipe and exhaled slowly. The most dangerous moment in any confrontation is not the battle itself, but the pause before it. Graves paused. He sealed his letter, placed it on the hall table, and went to the pub, confident that tomorrow would bring justice. He did not reckon with a housekeeper who could be bought, a street boy who could be hired, or a solicitor who could compress the entirety of a murder plot into 5 hours. He trusted the system. The system failed him, or rather, the people within the system failed him, which is the only way systems ever truly fail. I recorded these words in my notebook that evening, along with the other details of the case that I wished to preserve. It had been, in many respects, a quiet case. No dramatic chases, no exotic weapons, no criminal masterminds of international scope. It was a case built on small treacheries, a bribed housekeeper, a bullied coachman, a pinch of powder in a pint of ale. And yet it was, I thought, among the most instructive of all the cases I'd witnessed Holmes undertake, for it demonstrated with terrible clarity the principle that the most dangerous crimes are not those committed in passion, but those committed in arithmetic, calculated, compressed, and executed with the cold precision of a man who has weighed a human life against his own comfort and found the calculation acceptable. I sealed my account and placed it in the tin dispatch box where I kept the records of Holmes's cases, another chapter in the long chronicle that I had been compiling, with varying degrees of diligence since the day I first took lodgings at 221B Baker Street. Holmes had returned to his violin. I paused at the door of my bedroom and listened. The melody he had chosen was, for once, not the aimless scraping of a restless mind, nor the mournful airs he favoured during his darker moods. It was something resolute, measured, deliberate, with a clarity of purpose that filled the room like light filling a window. It was the sound, perhaps, of justice delivered, if not of grief undone. I closed my door and left him to his music. The fire crackled. The morning's newspaper lay folded on the table, its headlines already old, and somewhere in London a letter written by a dead man's hand was making its way at last to the address it had always been intended to reach, carried not by the morning post but by the steady hand of a nephew who had learned, in the hardest possible way, that some debts cannot wait until tomorrow,